Very good. Right, let's crack on with it. It's my sad but very distinct honour to moderate what is the final session of another magnificent Riga conference, and my congratulations to our hosts for what another wonderful job that they've done. Hear, hear. Deterrence by resilience. Are democracies proactive enough in protecting Western values? That is the stuff of this important discussion that we're about to have. That great quote from Benjamin Franklin, I think, is apposite. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Now, it might seem that that great quote is as pertinent today as it was then, but those who know the quote will understand that Franklin wrote it about a minor tax dispute in Pennsylvania. It's amazing how things get out of control. So there you have it. But the language resonates in this age of social media, of maskirovka, and of course of interference, because it raises not only a fundamental question of can we trust our systems, but what must the state do to protect those systems, and what is the balance of competencies and indeed engagement in the process which it must undertake. There are three questions at the heart of the debate that we will have. First, how can democracies respond to these challenges and protect themselves without sacrificing the values of freedom of speech and expression? Two, do Western societies believe strongly enough in their value system, and are we, willing to protect it? And three, how should democratic governments balance military and non-military means to ensure deterrence by resilience, resilience of our systems, of our freedom, of our democracy? To address these questions, I'm honoured to moderate a stellar panel. In order of intervention, they are as follows. First, Mr. Jānis Garrisons, State Secretary here at the Ministry of Defence in Latvia. Jānis, good to see you. Second, the Right Honourable the Earl Howe, Minister of State for Defence from my own country, the United Kingdom. Sir, good to have you here. Third, His Excellency Mr. Jüri Luik, Minister of Defence of Estonia. Sir, again, always a privilege to share a panel with you. And last, but most definitely not least, Dr. Michael Waller, Vice President of the Centre for Security Policy and President of Georgetown Research. Now, before I hand the floor over, some quick rules of engagement so no one is under any illusions. My panel each has 10 minutes, no more, gentlemen, I'm a stern chairman, to make their introductory remarks. I will take questions in blocks of 3, but I will guillotine it when I see fit, because I want to ensure that we end on time, and I can hand over for concluding remarks to my friend, the Minister here, who will give us his remarks at the end. So, without further ado, I would like to invite Jānis, please, to take the floor.
Well, thank you, Julian, and good afternoon. I was afraid that there will be few people in the room, because you might be afraid of, that I will ask again, raise your hands whether you are ready to fight or not. No, this time I will not. But actually, what I'm going to talk, I will try to explain why resilience is important and why the values in resilience are important. Before, I think yesterday I was watching actually a stream from from the conference in Stockholm, and I was impressed by the panel on NATO. You were focusing mainly on the military part of that, but I think the whole conference actually indicates those problems that we have: military, then we have social media, anything, everything that's happening right now. And therefore, I think we have to take more comprehensive look. And I would say we have four, if I would analyze current security environment, I would put four main issues what we are facing, and that I think it's important to understand those issues in order to prepare responses. The first issue, I think, the Western democracies and Western world as such is not the point of attraction anymore. And I think we have to recognize it, because we believe, and Fukuyama in 1990, beginning of 90s, believed that democracy is won. We know the perpetuum peace of Kant will be. Actually, it's not true anymore. We see that democracies are not attractive, and we are not regarded as main power of the future. And that, I think, is very important to understand for our future strategies. Then we, I think, have mismanaged or misunderstood everything that our information and technologies have brought to us. We as democracies, because we were very happy about what's going on in Arab Spring, we saw that is spread of democracies and everything, but suddenly we discovered, oh, we are not, actually we have even more weaknesses as they when it comes to social media. And I think we still don't have good answers to many questions, because we can't do the same, to employ the same responses as any authoritarian country to close something, because we can't deal with the same tools. And therefore, we still have to understand how we will deal with those issues, because technologies will develop even faster, and we will not be able to manage, actually, we will not be able to counter every day, to, if we are in reactive mode. Then we are facing radical ideologies, and those radical ideologies, they are ready to fight, and they are ready to fight also with us, and they are ready to fight not for some salaries or for, they are ready to fight for ideas. And I think that is also very important to understand. And the last thing, I think we also have to recognize that in our democratic societies, we have very vague frame of values, a system of values, because it's somehow during last decades, in exploiting the peace dividend, we lost our the real meaning of values, and I will touch. And therefore, if you combine all those four, I would say, you have radical ideologies, you have on our side vague values, and you have to basically defend your country. How can we resist and protect ourselves? And therefore, I think in order to go further on and not to basically step on the same pattern of authoritarian countries, we have to, it's its own way, it's resilience. We have to strengthen our societies. And what does it mean to strengthen our societies? And values are important. And as we now celebrating 100 years of our independence, I want to use two examples. The first example, we started independence war in 1919, actually December 1918 even. Our government was supported by only a company-sized unit. It's 120 people left Riga to protect the government, and that was only fighting force. And they decided that those values are worth to fight for. And we ended with allies, but we ended war. We fought and defeated Soviet Union and Landeswehr with 70,000 of army. That was because people believed in something. In 1940, we decided for quiet surrender. We had 4 divisions, we had tanks, we had aircraft, everything. We had everything. We spent 1/4 of our GDP on military spendings. But somehow society and the politicians decided that it's not worth to fight. And everybody knows where we ended. One massacre of officers, 10% of our population ended in Siberia and never came back. Then we fought on both sides, on Nazi and the Soviet side, and 50 years in Soviet Union without any freedom. And that was a result of not being willing to fight for principles and values. And where I see the problem now, and I was actually struck by, I had discussion with a lecturer from university, and she said me that, you know, I just polled students, and the big majority said that, why are you asking us to fight for something? If we have internet, we don't care what the government is on the power. And we don't care unless we know we can move. And I think that's actually, it's quite shocking to me, and it's very worrying to me, because it indicates that there's something wrong with our values. Because the values, freedom is not about internet. The freedom is about freedom of speech and ability to be able to express. And democracy is not about ability to criticize, but democracy is about responsibility. And I think we somewhere been lost, those fundamental things being lost in our education, because we everything receive as for granted. And I think that is our big problem where we stand now, and we actually have to take decisions. And when it comes to resilience, what resilience means? Resilience means resist, survive, and recover, because you have to resist whatever it is, either it's information or any influence operations or military. You have to survive if it's military attack or if it's natural disasters, and you have to basically recover afterwards. And in that kind, I would draw 3 main points, main things what are important in this kind of modern resilience. That is a military component, which is, of course, I think it's wrong to assume that military force doesn't play any role, because military power is understood by everybody, and we shouldn't be misled by the thing, people who say that soft power without military is something. No, it's not. It's about the second point is civil readiness and preparedness, because we have to be prepared for different kind of situation, including natural disasters, but also for the times of war. And we have to know what we have to do in such kind of situations, starting from first aid and ending with production of industries. And the last point is a psychological preparedness, because I think especially in this information age, it's very important that citizens are prepared psychologically for everything what they're facing. And it's in this country we're facing influence operations on daily basis. And people should be sure what are they placed and what they can expect. And you can do it only, combining, because each of those 3 affects one another. Psychological preparedness affects military as well as civilian, and vice versa. And therefore, I think what we have to reconsider how our education is functioning, because everything starts from education. If you don't teach it in schools, the basic things, then...
1 minute, Yanis.
Yes, I'm almost done. If you don't teach in schools basic things, then, of course, that might end in quite unpleasant. You have to think how to engage all members of society in all 3 elements: military, civilian preparedness, and psychological resistance, and basically to make society more resilient and make also a deterrent against outside threats.
Thank you, Yanis. Yeah, very, very clear, as always. I mean, the main message was the need to strengthen our societies, military preparedness, civil preparedness. I would describe your psychological preparedness as effectively treating the citizens as partners and grown-ups. I think we've got into a situation, often in Europe, where we haven't always treated the citizens as grown-ups. And if we are indeed to preserve our structures, they must be essential partners in this process. Oh, how? Sir, please.
Thank you very much, Julian. Well, perhaps I could just echo your initial words by thanking our hosts for this conference and thanking them for including me in it. It's a great privilege to be here. I think this is quite a difficult exam question. Yanis has covered the ground, really, if I may say, admirably. But I'd like to begin by focusing on an important word included in the question, and that is resilience. What is resilience? I think it's fair to say resilience means different things to different people. But if we want a definition that we can readily sign up to, I think we need look no further than the NATO definition, which actually Yanis paraphrased well. This is how NATO sums up resilience: the ability of the community, services, areas or infrastructure to detect, prevent, and if necessary, withstand, handle and recover from disruptive challenges. Well, disruptive challenges can come from several sources and by several means. Defense provides resilience in several ways. At the most basic level, we make sure that our own organization in the armed forces is shock-proof. That's to say resilient in assets, in manpower, in systems. But more broadly, our armed forces stand ready to respond to any national crisis. But there's another element in our resilience that is hidden, I think, in that definition, something that brings it very close to deterrence, because resilience depends on being proactive and visibly proactive, because by presenting a strong and credible image of our capabilities, we are less likely to be targeted by our adversaries. So we improve our ability to deter. So back to the question, are democracies proactive enough in protecting Western values? Well, if you'd asked me that 10 years ago, I'd probably have said yes. Yes. After all, the West was still basking in the afterglow of the end of the Cold War. Our assessment back then, believe it or not, was that we had no state adversaries. No state adversaries. Well, times have changed. In fact, our need for resilience is rising by the day, and that's because of the proliferation, as Yanis said, the proliferation of the threats that we face. On the one hand, we've got climate change, we have pandemic disease, we have mass migration. Those have increased the natural hazards that were once regarded as the principal focus for resilience. But on the other hand, we're also contending with a rise in malicious actions, either from terrorists or state-on-state aggressors. And more disturbing still, those latter dangers are converging because non-state actors are behaving in like states, in acquiring sophisticated weaponry, and aggressor states are aping extremists, operating in a grey zone of subversion below the level of direct conflict, using proxies, using misinformation, using cyber attack. Our adversaries have observed and understand full well the digitization and the complex interdependence of modern economies. And they know how easily one vulnerability can concertina into another one. And as the head of the Russian military, General Valery Gerasimov, put it, the rules of war have changed. He regards victory between peer state actors as far more about how to collapse adversaries from within, rather than about traditional methods applied from without. And the Kremlin's predilection for this new type of warfare has been seen on very prominent display in the Ukraine. So, yes, it is clear to me that in this new age of warfare, democracies have to be even more proactive in protecting Western values. Let me briefly outline how we in the UK are proactively approaching this issue of resilience. And I think there are three main ways in which we are doing this. First, the obvious way, by strengthening our capability to deter and deny our adversaries militarily, whether that's through traditional hard power, air defense, maritime coastal defense, missile defense, whether it's through the capacity for force projection, or whether through the new domains of space and cyberspace. So, for example, if a certain country threatens an incursion into our sovereign airspace, we can and do prevent this by a rapid and timely response. And that's why we're investing heavily in military assets. And alongside that, we're putting a lot of money into innovation, in autonomy, artificial intelligence, machine learning, that will allow us to reduce our areas of vulnerability to a minimum and at the same time exploit those of our adversaries. We're focusing on training and skills. It's why we've undertaken a root and branch evaluation called Modernizing Defense, which will make sure we have the right capabilities into the future. The second area of resilience is about coherence across government. We recognize that the risks and threats that we face are not just military ones. So we absolutely need to make sure that there is greater coherence and coordination across government and across all our public services. There is a tendency in many countries to create departmental silos. That is not conducive to resilience. So we are integrating different arms of government, breaking down artificial cross-government boundaries to eliminate blind spots between departments so that we really can harness the full range of our national security capabilities. And critically, in coordinating bodies such as our National Cyber Security Centre, we work hand in hand with the private sector to provide effective response to incidents. Now, the third area of resilience I think is very important. We are consciously becoming more international in our approach, more international by design, as we say. Few of the problems that we face in the UK are unique to us, and many of them, because of our increasing interdependence, are shared. Cyber threats, a good example, criminal networks, threats more generally to the rules-based order. So allies and partners offer a valuable pool of expertise, on thought, on which to draw, and of course an added source of resilience and deterrence. And that's why, even as the UK leaves the EU, we will continue playing a leading role in the defense of our continent, not least through NATO, of course. But perhaps I could just say here, it's significant, I think, that the alliance does not yet have a consistent approach to the concept of resilience, which I believe opens up an opportunity for us to do more on sharing perspectives and experience and best practice. Increasing our collective resilience is really vital. We're only as strong as our weakest link. But the point I will conclude on, if I may, and I've already alluded to this, is that resilience goes beyond defense. Yanis described it very well. It has to be reflected throughout society. After all, Russia sees the main battleground as being hearts and minds. So hearts and minds are, if anything, even more important. How can we achieve that? Well, through debates and discussions like this is not a bad start, and through asserting and projecting our Western values at every opportunity. Our societies are not perfect. No nation can prevent every accident or incident, but we should never forget how our values of democracy, tolerance, justice, continue to offer the maximum opportunity to the maximum number of people to get on in life freely and securely. We should never forget how, in years gone by, our democracies shone a light of hope on people who were oppressed by dictatorships and communism and helped to end the Cold War. And we should remind ourselves that even today, when we stand together in defiance of Daesh or Russian aggression, we achieve great things. We need to keep reminding people of how important that is. As long as our people remember those truths, we will discover not only the resilience to defend our nations at dark times, but also the power to keep advancing those precious ideals and values across the world.
Thank you, sir. Very clear. There can be no liberty without security. You described what I call the war at the seams that is being conducted by our adversaries, the seams of democracy. You talked about strength and deterrence. I note today that the first F-35 aircraft landed on our first supercarrier, HMS Queen Elizabeth, which will be a major asset for NATO and the defence of democracy. You talked about a whole-of-government approach, coherence across government to promote resiliency within the state, and that it's by definition more international by design, given the nature of the threats. I think you concluded on a very important message, and I'm a chauvinist about this. I believe firmly that the world is a safer place when Western democracies are confident about our values, and we don't apologise about it to anyone. Minister, please.
Thank you very much, and I would also like to thank the organisers of the excellent Riga conference, and thank you very much for inviting me here to speak in this panel with my distinguished co-panelists. As was said, resilience has many different aspects. I would focus on hearts and minds. To start with, I think it is very important for us to understand what are the methods of our opponents, particularly of Russia, in this fight for hearts and minds. As was pointed out, the Russian actions in information warfare against the West have a very strong theoretical basis, and they are based to the so-called Gerasimov doctrine, which is very significant because we should treat this kind of information warfare as warfare. We have to understand that our opponent has resources, structures, strategy, operational readiness, and tactics to conduct this warfare. It is not a joke. It is not something which is done on a whim. It is a real organized system. Now, we know these mechanisms quite well, but I don't think that as a society at large we have a grasp of how serious and how well thought out these methods are. And because it's a sort of a warfare, we also have to understand that some of the aspects of values which we are so proud of are not necessarily part of the fight in this war or in this conflict. And let me come back to it. When looking at the Russian approach or Russian strategy, basically Russians have two options. One is to win the hearts and minds with the positive angle of Russian culture, the Russian civilization, etc., etc. These aspects are all there. There are enough people in the world who honor people from Chekhov to Dostoevsky to other artists, philosophers, etc., etc. This sort of basis is there. But surprisingly, Russian propagandists have given up on that. They don't introduce positive messages. They have a different approach. They have defined the West as almost genetically Russia critical. And they have defined this conflict, this warfare, in very stark terms. When you don't necessarily focus on the conflict of ideas or challenge of each other's ideas, but you basically focus on ripping up the structures of the democratic society. And here, and this has been pointed out many times, it is not so important which ideas you actually support. It's important that these ideas, these conflicts, these frictions inside the society are strong enough so they are capable of tearing your society, your Western society, apart. So the question really is democracy resilient enough? It's a complicated question because we have to admit that there are aspects in our democratic development which have fundamentally changed. And that's why we cannot compare the democracy during the Cold War or post-Cold War with the democracy of today. Today's democratic society has weaknesses which the previous times didn't have. And the weakness and the strength is the new means of communications, the social media. It has many, many positive aspects, but it has a couple of very negative aspects, and I think we have to admit that. We have to face it. First problem is the issue of values. If you look at what the Russian propagandists are doing, they have brought back or strengthened the values debate. I mean, there is a nascent values debate everywhere in our societies. But if you are skillful enough, you can exacerbate it to the point that it, inside the society, becomes a real conflict. I think we have also made a mistake. The liberal democracy has made a mistake of not focusing on values enough, not to build up the constructive power of values. In fact, for a long time, we didn't even want to speak about values. The liberal idea of the primacy of individual in some ways forced us to push aside the values debate. The societies became very rational. Now we see that there is a hunger for values, there's a hunger for values debate, and since we haven't been very good at it, our opponents can use this as one of the tools. And the other aspect is what I would call direct democracy. Of course, the social networks allow every citizen to participate in the debate over the fate and future direction of the society. And all in all, it's a good thing. But it can also be used for negative consequences, because it has essentially destroyed something which we would call elite, political elite, journalism elite. There is no structure anymore, there is no class anymore, which would try to, I wouldn't say, which would try to formulate it in a way that it is usable in a coherent society. There are so many voices now, so many ideas, so many thoughts, that if a propagandist, if an enemy, then takes it all together, wraps it into an easy, sensible ideology, then it can be extremely, extremely powerful. And our own side, for instance, editors of major newspapers, have lost the power of formulating the narrative. And I think that's a major problem. And finally, a couple of points about, let's say, this was the bit about the general challenges. Let me point out a couple of more technical approaches which Estonia uses in this information warfare, or if we want to be more soft, in information conflict. I think one of the points we have to keep in mind is that since it's an information conflict, some of the measures which are used are not corresponding to the abstract idea of the press freedom, because we are dealing not with the actual media, but in terms of Russian propaganda, we are dealing with propaganda tools. And many countries have used means like declaring RT, for instance, a foreign agent. Or, for instance, Estonia didn't accredit RT to the European defense ministers meeting in Tallinn. We simply said, you are not a media outlet, we don't accredit you. So there are certain measures where we have to be firm enough to show our strength. And I think that's unavoidable. It is very important to reveal the methods used against us. Revealing is extremely, extremely powerful weapon. Perhaps you have seen the news that Russian propagandists were on both sides of the debate, which has nothing to do with Russian-Western relations. It was the debate about vaccination in the United States. They played both sides. First, people who said children should be vaccinated, and then on the other side, people who shouldn't. And they played out the whole conflict. And only the very respectful society of medical professionals, which studied and revealed the whole construct, was sort of strong enough to explain to the society this important phenomenon. For instance, in
1 minute, please, Minister. 1 minute.
Sorry, perhaps only one other example, which is in Estonia we have this interesting society which is called Propastop, propaganda stop, basically, Propastop. And this consists of the volunteers. There are journalists, there are media experts from various walks of life. It's completely non-governmental. They have created an internet site, and since they are real pros, they can find sort of fake articles and information which has been deliberately pushed by our opponents, reveal it, post it, and very clearly show where this information comes from. It is important that it's a voluntary group of professionals whom we could never pay as a state. We simply don't have this kind of money These are very, very serious people from private enterprises. And they do it voluntarily because they appreciate that the society should stick together and be serious about this kind of conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I love the vision of proper stop. It's a wonderful vision. And the idea that civil society itself is taking a leading role in the defence of civil society. And that's a very, very important message. I think your message that our enemies are turning our freedom against us is a very important realisation. And I, for one, do not believe that we should leave that space that they have to do that uncontested. It's very important that they understand that we too can contest the battle of ideas about which you talked. Mike.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you for the organizers to invite me to this fantastic event. We especially need transatlantic dialogue now with so much divisiveness and misunderstanding and sort of things, unscripted things that often get misinterpreted. But in looking at this problem, first, the Russians have been subverting all of us for 100 years. The Kremlin has. So this is nothing new. Second, a third quote from Ben Franklin, when he was walking out of the Constitutional Convention, and some people in the public said, "What kind of government have you put together for us?" He said, "A republic, if you can keep it." So even from the beginning, he was wondering, can a democracy, a democratic republic in this case, even keep itself? And we did. It wasn't perfect, and it was with a lot of fits and starts and a civil war in between. But it managed to survive. So to answer a question, I think the original question of this panel was, can democracy win in modern battle? And my answer would be yes, if it wants to. But there are three points, and all, again, as pointed out before, psychological dimensions. First, well, what are Western values in the 21st century? And you see this divisiveness in the United States and in Europe now, where you have sort of a post-Judeo-Christian values versus traditional Judeo-Christian values clashing. Each one accusing the other of being Russian agents at the same time. So you have that. Do we have eternal truths as Western values, or are they just transient fashions? And why would we defend a transient fashion if we don't have an eternal truth? So since we have all this, rather than fight about it, let's just appreciate the diversity of values we have within our Western democracies and proceed from there. How resilient can we be? The Kremlin, of course, and others want us to fight one another. They want us to devour ourselves. We do a pretty good job, speaking in my own country, of devouring ourselves, especially over the past few years. And there's a reaction to too much government, too much power, and too much elitism, and the common people are fighting back, as they are in parts of Europe. So the Kremlin thrives on this, yet we have to also be cognizant of the fact that they're doing that, and they're going to be exploiting this. It's entirely normal, where the democracy can be the weapon of the aggressor, one's own democracy. Second is, when we suppress the truth, we attack our values. And we've come to the point where we so much have this overweening desire not to offend that we end up giving up what we believe in. It's okay to speak of killing large numbers of people in the name of defending our societies, but offending them is not something we should do. So when we suppress the truth, we attack our own values. And when we prevent the people from stating the truth, how can 100 children and teachers get hit by a truck across the sea and no one wants to talk about why? And in some places, we're even jailing our own people for talking the truth about things that are politically incorrect, so we can't speak the truth. We're surrendering our Western values when we do that kind of thing. We're letting our enemies do that to us. Forcing or shaming allies into accepting a certain view or denying a certain truth corrodes our very identities, to say nothing of our values. So that was the first one. The second one, national sovereignty itself, second issue, is a core Western value of its own. It has to be protected at all costs. And while we surrender part of authority or part of sovereignty by joining an alliance or by joining a large transnational organization. We have to keep in mind that the whole purpose of having a national defense is to protect our own national sovereignty. And each group of countries, each country, has its own identity that it needs to protect. And sometimes I think the global elites tend to have an idea that nationhood really doesn't matter as much as the greater good, or the world community, or the global citizen. That's not necessarily true. For example, NATO is a voluntary alliance of sovereign countries. So you can leave when you want to, but there's never been a Brexit in NATO, except for maybe Charles de Gaulle for a short period, but we fixed that okay. Sovereignty is not isolationism. It's not chauvinistic. It can't survive without allies. It has to be internationalist to survive. If you look at President Trump's 2017 Warsaw speech, or his 2017 national security strategy, or his recent speech to the UN General Assembly, the scripted part, you'll see repeated references to not just American sovereignty, but envisioning a whole world of sovereign nations that can all prosper and live in peace and work together, but sovereign nations with governments that are responsible to their own populations. So NATO is NATO is here to defend it, but it's also threatened by other pressures to deprive countries of their own sovereignty. Some NATO allies, as we've talked about here already, want to make the alliance dependent on Vladimir Putin's natural gas switch, and in turn pump the Kremlin full of hard currency to bail out the hostile regime. Others of us think that's a real problem for a military alliance. That raises questions about the usefulness of certain members of the alliance, or the validity of the alliance, or the infiltration of the alliance, the reliability of key countries in the alliance. It's not merely an economic issue. Some fear for sovereignty, and they end up flirting with Putin. Or Putin's agents come out and flirt with them. This is to be expected, but it doesn't have to be a permanent situation. There's a temptation to weaponize accusations for political gain by accusing people of being Russian agents. So NATO is strong as long as its members are sovereign, and sovereignty being this core Western value that we must defend. The third issue is, if you keep yourself on the strategic defensive, you're going to lose. Nobody wants to follow a football game that always plays defense. Democracies that are not proactive in defense of their values are going to lose. This is not an expensive expense. We just heard from the minister here about the private initiatives going on, but imagine if this was done as part of one's military reserve duty or National Guard duty or something else as a contribution to the overall national defense, especially if it's a smaller country where it's not affordable or practical to have a large investment in hardware and infrastructure. We have to be vigilant to this, but we cannot just be defensive to it. Russia's going to exploit all our vulnerabilities, including elections, as it has. And we try to respond with sanctions or messaging, whatever else. But we sort of recoil in horror at the idea of thinking of unconventional approaches to what we consider unconventional problems. So we don't want to consider them. We throw them out. It's too extreme, it's too crazy, it won't work, no one's going to do it, whatever. So in this case, though, we need to have a political and economic equivalence of deterrence along the force continuum. We have a nuclear deterrent. It's okay with all of us to have a strategy of mass genocidal radioactive annihilation of humanity to keep our Western values, but we can't hurt anybody's feelings by pointing out certain truths. So we have to figure out what is our continuum going to be on the political and economic side. Is it Article 5 won't defend us against this?
Minute, please.
So we need a strategy to map out and exploit those vulnerabilities of the Kremlin regime, of the gangster states, and even of the Russian Federation itself. Not simply slapping sanctions on everybody in Putin's inner circle, but maybe playing favorites, maybe getting to fight each other. Maybe doing cyber attacks to steal their bank account money and using it to fund opposition movements. Being really creative with how we use our economic and political systems. Promote regime infighting. Even promote irredentism in the Russian Federation. Not something some of our Russian friends are going to like, but it's something that we should be thinking about as a way of having that capability and showing the Russian regime we have the will and the ability to use it. At the same time, engage the Russian population as much as possible and prepare for a sudden collapse in the Russian Federation regime and take advantage of it the way we failed to do in 1991.
Thank you, Mike. Fantastic. 10 minutes spot on. I mean, what I take from what you said, it's basically physician, heal thyself. That we need to hold a mirror up to our own behaviors and values, where we've become extremists within our own societies about how we interpret the values that we hold so dear. And that no one can say anything anymore because of the risk of offending someone, and therefore when you can't do that, you can't take action. But let me abuse my position as a chair very briefly and ask you all very quickly to answer this question. At the centre of our concept of security is the rules-based system and order. Rules. And yet, both the internet and our enemies equal anarchy. The internet is not freedom, it's anarchy. And our enemies are exploiting that anarchy which penetrates our societies deeply. How does the state effectively engage that anarchy and bring some order to it? Because surely, if we don't, there'll be no security. Yanis.
Well, I think I can start with what we certainly should avoid. We should avoid in imposing very strict regulations. I think we will get completely opposite results if we will impose very strict regulations. But what we can do, we can first of all draw the frame of what is actually fit in our values and what is not. And I think we've done it very successfully with electronic media, where we defined hate speech of war, hatred, and things like that. And whenever you actually step out of those boundaries, you will be punished, and everybody knows that. I think that is something. And of course, the third thing is education. You have to educate people, critical thinking, and things like that.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, how?
If we look at trying to muzzle the media, we're in very dangerous territory.
Indeed.
So we don't want to go down that route. On the other hand, it seems to me in the direct interests of our media organs, whether that is the press, the broadcasting organs, or indeed the organs of social media like Google and Facebook and so on, it's in their interests to have people trust what they are saying and doing. And it does therefore seem to me to be at least a case for discussion that governments and the media should have an understanding about communicating with each other on what is fake news, what is misinformation, disinformation, so that the various channels of the press and so on are acting in a responsible way. So it does come back to responsibility, that point that Yanis made earlier, but also I think trust. Trust in any relationship surely has to be the most important ingredient. Somehow we've got to get there.
Indeed. Thank you, sir. Mr. Luke.
I think one of the aspects which is extremely important, and I pointed it out also in my intervention, is really the fact that our rule-based society is based on a certain set of values. And we have to bring the two together, because nowadays, especially perhaps for younger generation, elections is a method. I mean, it's a method, it's a technical method, it's not a value in itself. So it is very difficult to explain that losing an election, you actually losing elections from the society. You actually lose part of what you are as a human individual.
Yes.
So I think we have to come back to these very basic ideas which underpin our democratic system.
Thank you. Mike.
First, on a lot of it with the search engines and the social media, a market approach is working where they require trust and for advertising and for the information on all of us that they sell. You're seeing right now Google and Facebook are in a lot of pain right now for violating that public trust. So I think that type of thing will solve itself with a minimum of legislation or government intervention. But when it's a state-to-state thing, the offending state should be made to feel a lot of pain. And that's where we don't have anything in our use of force continuum to inject that appropriate amount of pain at that appropriate
This would be a kind of information deterrence. We will be doing similar things or similar lines of things to them if they do it to us, as it were.
Right.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, it strikes me as realistic in the current age.
Julian, there is I think it's right. I think I'm right in saying there is an EU proposal for a sanctions regime for malign cyber.
Yes, indeed.
People. So that's worth
very, very important indeed.
Thinking about. Oh.
Right, the floor is now open. We have 20 minutes. I'll take batches of threes. One, sir, on the edge here. Say who you are, please. Keep the question short and direct it to whom you wish it.
Actually, I will ask who would answer would be truly much appreciating. Coming from the country where the military service is obligatory, and even sometimes we're discussing how the using Israel case with the women engagement or Norway case. What do you think in many of your countries where military service is not obligatory? Is it properly to communicate this same message and get the resilience by deterrence by this resilience, because many people will come and serve to the security institutions and by this start to change their attitude that security is not simply given if you're not bringing your own contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, in the middle here.
Thank you. I'm Carsten Friis from Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Thank you for excellent panel. I would like to follow up a little bit. We heard a lot about resilience, but not so much about deterrence, except towards the end. I would like maybe to challenge the rest of the panel, because resilience is kind of deterrence by denial, but we're not being really hurt by it. But we also talk about the deterrence by punishment, response, and I think that's what you were alluding to. So I'd like to challenge the rest of the panel. Should we do more in responding to these unconventional attacks and not just sit and being defenders?
Thank you, Carsten. Lady at the back. Some serious microphone moving going on.
Thank you very much. I'm Mary Dejevsky. I write for The Independent in London and for The Guardian. I want to speak as a member of the media. And I know the chairman and some others on the platform said we must be careful about muzzling the media. But I'd just like to read back something that Mr. Leuk said when he said that editors have lost the power of formulating the narrative. I think that's a major problem. Would Mr. Leuk like to elaborate on that and maybe say how he would propose to solve what he describes as the problem? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister Leuk, I'm going to invite you to respond directly to Mary's challenge from The Guardian, if you would, sir.
Can I answer
please,
some of the other questions?
Please
First, Estonia has the obligatory national military service, and I very much agree with you that it's an important part in communicating with the society and explaining the the values of the society. When it comes to deterrence, then in information warfare, our best deterrence is truth. Truth and also revealing some of the methods of what the opposition is using. There are hybrid threats which can be deterred. For instance, I seriously believe that a major cyber attack can be deterred. A major cyber attack by a state actor, because all states are vulnerable to this cyber attack. Also the states who might believe that it would be a great idea to take on another nation state with a major cyber attack. Everybody's structures are extremely vulnerable. I think that there is a certain balance of fear here. People don't want to go down this road. Small picking here and there, yes, but major attack, very unlikely. When it comes to the question about the chief editors, I have to be extremely careful here, of course. What I meant was that chief editors traditionally created the culture of the newspaper, the sort of philosophy of the newspaper. They provided a minimum quality control. I'm sure there are journalists who hate that, but I think that's one of the value of especially the old distinguished newspapers, like what you are representing. Nowadays, it's almost not possible. The chief editor will tell you, you heard a rumor, you heard news, get it out immediately. We are in the competition, put it at first to Twitter, then to our blog, then to our electronic media, then perhaps we'll give you a couple of hours so that you can write the story to the newspaper. I have friends who are journalists, so I imagine well, I've studied journalism myself, I'm a journalist by education. I imagine well how this happens today in newspapers. So I'm longing for this kind of old-fashioned editor. I think that was an important part of media outlet being a solid sort of source of tool for objective information. The objective information is not that everybody speaks, because you can never find the truth from those thousands and thousands of bits of information.
Thank you. How that question about how does one communicate almost create discipline within complex societies in which tools like conscription no longer exist as vehicles in which to impart information?
Well, as I'm sure the audience knows, in the UK we don't have conscription. We used to. We gave that up many years ago. Military service is not obligatory. But at the same, we took the view that to have professional armed forces was the best means of deterrence. Having said that, I think it's terribly important that we find other ways of communicating values and what goes with them. We do have, for example, our citizenship program, which David Cameron introduced. I'm really enthusiastic about that. For young people, we have the cadet movement, which is also expanding very encouragingly. So there are means by which we can do this without conscripting people. But I agree that this is a really important, should be a really important focus for democracies. And frankly, in the UK, we have further work to do on it.
Indeed.
Deterrence, though, should be responding more. I absolutely agree. We can deter cyber attack. There are classic classifications of deterrence: deterrence by denial, deterrence by punishment, deterrence by defiance, deterrence by collaboration. All those things, I think, if you put them together, are very, very powerful. But at the same time, alerting our people, our populations, to the fact that we have to be ready for shocks and surprises, and hence we need to be resilient psychologically, coming back to what Yanis said at the beginning. So if you put all those together, I do believe that deterrence is achievable. We will never succeed every time, but we can succeed a lot of the time, I believe.
Michael Howe was basically expounding your idea of a big house deterrence in which it stretches right across civil and indeed military society. How would you see that future deterrence working across a range of threats, from hybrid warfare to cyber warfare up to high-end hyper warfare?
That's a huge subject, but just to start...
Yeah, I'm writing a book about it, that's why I asked.
Oh, okay. Let's start on the decision-maker side.
Yeah.
So the Russians, have something that they call kompromat. We don't generally use that in our societies, although you see it sort of when certain presidential candidates or something run, or there's a Supreme Court nominee or something. But I mean, there's no sort of file of blackmailable dirt that's collected to use in a state-to-state relationship, at least that we know publicly about. I think it would be a great asset for all alliance members and other friends to be collecting kompromat on certain troublemakers and all their family and all their friends. Where about Vladimir Putin's stolen billions hidden? Who's hiding them? What are his kids doing? Whatever happened to Yeltsin's daughter, who they cut that secret deal with? What about all the other oligarchs around him? And how can we let them know that we have this dirt, where the mere exposure of it could put their lives at risk with the other people around them? That's one form of deterrence that we can have, and it can quietly be a chief of state in a private meeting with Putin, letting him know that this kompromat exists. Or there could be an unofficial way, a WikiLeaks type of system. There's an endless range of choices that we have. Deterrence
by leverage. Yanis, you want to make a comment on any one of these questions?
Well, I think, of course, conscription is something that we usually asked about. I think, yes, conscription probably can work in some way, but my argument is that then you have to have general conscription, because what most countries right now have, except of Israel, probably they have then conscripts only small part of population, and that is not general conscription if you want in the same way influence whole society. Therefore, that is one argument. But another thing what actually we decided to do, and it's along the same lines as you mentioned, we have cadet force as well, and we expanded it. But it's I think more important to go and start in schools already, because when you have 18-year-old youngster who does not believe in anything, you will not turn him, enforcing in some of the regiments, be patriotic or whatever else. Therefore, we decided to go for a defense curriculum in schools, and actually to teach many things what actually they might face, including military.
Thank you. And given constraints on time, I'm taking 3 last questions. Jill, down here, please. And then you, sir. Yeah.
Thank you. Jill Doherty from the Wilson Center. I have a question about, and I'm not quite sure to whom, but whoever wants to take it, on methods that are used now, which were used in the old Soviet days, but are more and more used today, which are Russian propaganda, not talking about Russia, not as, the Soviet Union, workers of the world unite, communism is good, the social welfare, etc. It's more that what's happening in the West is fake democracy. It doesn't work. In other words, exploiting the inability of Western democracies to really carry out democracy. In the United States, a good example is the Black Lives Matter movement, young black men being killed on the streets by police. What is your answer to that? Because, they're basically telling the truth, that in the West, there are certain rights that are not protected, and there are certain ways that democracies don't live up to their democratic goals. So how would you answer that?
Thank you, Jill. Sir.
My name is Robert Rasums. I am a student in the University of Latvia. And my question is to Earl Ho. British here is the only nation that has fought for its survival in the last 100 years and succeeded. And one of the reasons why World War II ended like this was that this fight was never for survival, for deterrence. It was for winning, for elimination of threat. And my question is, do we really have a will to win, to eliminate our threat? And if we have not, can we really survive?
Direct question. And the final question, far side there, please, sir, in uniform.
Thanks. Raymond Farrell, Canadian Army. It's been said we get the governments we deserve. And we've seen in the last 10 years popularly elected, popularly supported illiberal governments rolling back independence of the press or attacking judicial independence and so on. So my question, and I don't know yet, my dilemma, I ask any of you is, how far is a democracy entitled to protect itself from a popularly elected movement or government which wishes to undo democracy?
Thank you, sir. Earl Howe, if I may start with that direct question to you. Have we the will to win?
I think we need to look at the word we and look at the word win, what we mean by win. If we mean to overcome the contrary ideologies that are thrust at us and to, in the end, bring Russia back, if we are talking about Russia, into the fold, the family fold of nations, as actually, I'm sure all of us would wish, ideally, should happen, well, we have to be very determined. But how far do we go? Obviously, we don't want to have to resort to hard military power. But I do think in the conversation that we've had today, we have seen various imperatives coming to the fore about the psychological battle we have with our own populations, the social messaging, and the deterrence posture that we adopt to make sure that we are seen to be resolute. It's very important, I think, that it's that deterrence by defiance that I was referring to earlier. So yes, I mean, I have no doubt that governments are determined to win. What we have to do is to make sure that our people are behind us and understand why we are investing in the military, why we are doing what we're doing in the cyberspace and so on. So just to sum up, I think we have work to do, but we certainly at government level have that determination. And that feeds into Jill's question about telling the truth. We are not living up to our goals as Western societies. How do we explain that away when the Russians are telling us how we're falling short? I think we just have to be completely open and say, no, society is perfect. We have failings. It's up to all of us to address them, and here's how we're going to do it, and governments should lead on that conversation.
Thank you. I'm going to use the other two questions as the wrap-up statements at the end of this conference. Make them brief, please, gentlemen. I'll go in reverse order. There was Jill's question, how do we respond to painful truths being used as offensive propaganda? And there was a question from the Colonel, how far is democracy prepared to go to stop those who are not democrats using the means of democracy to destroy it? That's a fairly fundamental question. Mike.
Well, first on Jill's question, it's a really tough one because it's accurate reporting of reality that makes great enemy propaganda. We really need, in our own country's debates, to have a more mature political discourse and media coverage of these types of things, because a lot of it's just been really extreme on all sides and counterproductive and gets so far away from reality that it ends up playing into enemy hands. It's a time for national reflection on how, with this, even the Supreme Court nominee case, where it's it's some of the most miserable example one could ever want to show the rest of the world how our world's greatest deliberative body, as we like to call our Senate, behaves. So these are truths that we need to deal with, and always with our leaders being cognizant how does it play into adversary propaganda. There's also the other side to it too, which is to not try to show our adversaries the popularity of our way of life or our system or whatever, and point out, wow, look, Vladimir Putin is allowing the Chinese to take over central Russia and Siberia through illegal migration and buying up all the land and the industries there. He's selling out his country. He's not a Russian nationalist after all. And pointing out certain negative facts on the adversary's side as well. As opposed to how far is democracy entitled to go to defend itself if there's a popular vote in a democracy and populists take power and start dismantling a system? Is it done through legal means or illegal means? We've had a terrible history of this happening through legal means, and everyone sits by and lets it happen. So I don't have an answer to your question. All I would address is, how would an enemy take advantage of that to goad these countries to self-destruct through legal means?
Thanks, Mike. Minister.
Yeah, I agree. Jill's question is really a tough one. But I think we have to make a difference here. I mean, if Russian propaganda outlet points out that democracy is imperfect, I mean, that's not a problem. I don't see that as a problem. The problem is that when there is a deliberate attempt to tear our society apart, influence the elections, meaning there is a certain border, I think, between just distributing kind of negative propaganda but from there on going right after the sort of pillars of our society, like democratic elections, for instance. So I think there should be some difference. But if that happens, if they cross the line, I honestly don't see any other ways to combat it. This is not a question of ideas or arguments anymore, than to use some of the measures which I pointed out, like branding them foreign agents or using other means like that. I don't see this as a violation of the freedom of the media, because I don't consider them media outlets as such in the sense of the free flow of ideas. But this is a decision every society has to make, of course. And these are not easy solutions, by no means. When it comes to populism, this is another very good and very, very complicated question. We have found out that consensus among the elites on many of the issues is not equal to consensus among the population. Let me just pick, for instance, the death penalty. I mean, consensus among the elites is markedly different from the consensus among the ordinary citizens. And so speaking about those issues to the population is very complicated, but we have to do it. If we don't do it, if we don't explain it properly, then this kind of anti-elitist feeling crawls in. And you have seen all the populist parties are heavily anti-elitist. And I use elitist in a positive sense. It's a good word in my vocabulary. And it's against this class of people who try to sort of keep the society together, to create a common narrative. If that is destroyed, the option is either an anarchy or a dictator. So that's a very stark challenge. We haven't done a very good job at talking to our own population. We have we all have to do better. Everybody in this hall.
Thank you, sir. Briefly, please, How any more comments?
Well, as colleagues were just speaking, I reflected back to your opening words, if I may,
please.
Back at you, Julian, which is that I think we need to treat our electorates as more of partners than on the other side of an invisible fence. The voters that we have in our countries are not fools. They are intelligent people. A lot of the time they can distinguish between propaganda and a valid message. And I think that governments have got to be refrain from being patronizing towards the electorate.
Indeed.
In the ways that we've talked about.
Thank you, sir. Yanis, any final thoughts?
Yes, I think responding to the question about democracies and following the same thought, I think it would be very dangerous, actually, to start branding one democracy as democratic and as less democratic, because we would run in completely opposite direction where we want to go, where we need to look probably into those problems, why people actually are dissatisfied. And deal with those questions, because we can't simply say, you know, they are populists and, you know, they can't be voted to the parliament, or you know, there are some reasons why people actually trust them, because the previous probably parties or governments you know, did something what disillusioned population, and therefore we have to deal with that. On fake democracies, I think it's we have to basically not hide our problems. We have to discuss them. Absolutely. Because if we hide them, then somebody else will start, you know, campaign, and that, you know, then immediately the government or the parliament is in defensive positions, and that it's very difficult to manage. Therefore, probably open discussion with the society is what is needed. And I want to finish with the will. Actually, we fought our independence war, and we won it in the last 100 years as well, and we had this will, as I said. It's not only UK who fought.
Thank you, Yanis. Very well said, sir. Point well taken. Now, I'm going to undertake 3 tasks very quickly to conclude. When I was thinking about this session, I remembered a quote from Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which, as a young Oxford undergraduate historian, I was forced to read all 6 volumes thereof. I know, it was painful. But he wrote, and I quote, "In the end, more than freedom, they wanted security. They wanted a comfortable life, and they lost it all. Security, comfort, and freedom. When the Athenians finally wanted not to give to society, but for society to give to them, when the freedom they wished for most was freedom from responsibility, then Athens ceased to be free and was never free again." End quote. My second task is to invite you all to thank this magnificent panel for their thoughts. Thank you, gentlemen. And my third very pleasurable honour is to invite Minister Bergmanis here to close the conference. This session is adjourned. Thank you very much.
We heard a lot about elections and democracy, and we're just 1 week before general elections is here, and maybe our media brings this idea for our society, because here I heard a lot of good ideas how we are protect our democracy and values. Ladies and gentlemen, you know why I'm here. To say a few words and to bid you farewell. And I will start by saying and pointing out the strategic message to the world, what my president did in opening remarks. Latvia is on its eve to celebrate 100 years, as well as other two Baltic states. It is a value and strategic message. But the dream about the state could not happen if the strong spirit and will of people of Latvia, as well as our friends and allies, didn't work out. This year, Riga Conference on Defense and Security has unique historical spirit. It is centenary Riga Conference, and thank you all who made that alive, and thank you all who participated. We made it all together, friends. I hope you will pardon me, but I would like to conclude this outstanding conference on the subject of defense. I hope that these 2 days have shown you that for many sovereign, peaceful countries, NATO is indispensable as ever. In face of all our threats, for countries like my own, NATO is a bedrock upon which our future are built. In years ahead, Latvia will implement a whole-of-government approach to defense, where every citizen, every business and every institution will have a role to play in case our country is attacked. But even then, if we were to stand alone, no one can guarantee if it would be enough. I urge you, my allies and my friends, don't echo the voices that would leave each of us standing alone. The greatest achievement of our civilization is the empowerment of the individual, but the ability to work together as individuals and as states is what has allowed us to endure and prosper for so many years. My friends, stay united, stay strong. As promised, I now must bid you farewell, for even the good things must come to an end, except for NATO, not on our watch.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being able to stay here for 2 days. I hope you have enjoyed the intellectual exchange and networking and making new friends and learning something. I have to confess that nowadays it's becoming increasingly difficult to put together an event like this due to financial constraints, so donations are welcome. Due to overlapping agendas, well, we all have our professional and private balance to keep. And we also have competing conferences all around. And I'm so happy, we are so happy as organizers that you are willing to come back to Riga, to the frontline city of geopolitical tension. Yes, as representative of organizers, we are 3 main organizers, Latvian Transatlantic Organization, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Defense, but let me assure you that ministers are not doing housekeeping and everyday work, and still I very much thank you, both ministers, for helping us. Even state secretaries are not helping us with the everyday issues, but thank you, State Secretary, for being here and helping us. There are many more people in the both ministries who help us to make it to happen. And even more, there are many more volunteers who are around here at the back side of the conference room. This year we have about more than 80, I think 85 or even 90 volunteers who helped us. And of course, my team, the young people whom all I want to name now here, all of them helped us to have 2 pleasant days. Sabine, where you are, please raise your hand. Diana, Martins, Liga, Elina, Laura, Andrea, Anna, Jacobs, and Paula. So, thank you so much. And before we go to dinner, I have to say, these young people help you to get to the dinner place. Please follow them, and I'm very much thankful to all of you again, and let's see together next year. Thank you.